closing conversation, A Higher Civics, the Field of Civic Thought and Leadership. And let me introduce Professor Paul Carrese, our founding director, the founding director of SCETL. As I said yesterday, Paul took a legislative appropriation and a concept, the set of principles, the mission statement passed out in a page here today, and turned that into a very strong and growing program that's now moving into its second iteration with Rick Avermenko joining us in July. Paul, for nearly 2 decades, was professor of political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's the author of Cloaking Power, Montesquieu, Blackstone, and the Rise of Judicial Activism, and the co-editor of 3 other books, on George Washington, on constitutionalism, and on American grand strategy. His most recent work is Democracy and Moderation, Montesquieu, Tocqueville, and Sustainable Liberation. He studied at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and has held fellowships at Harvard, the University of Delhi as a Fulbright Fellow, and with the James Madison Program at Princeton University. Paul Carrese.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Will, and it's a real honor and pleasure to have this opportunity for a dialogue conversation with a founder of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and of what is now a national movement of departments, colleges, centers of civic thought and leadership around the country. Let me inadequately briefly introduce Professor Harvey Mansfield. He is now a research professor of government at Harvard, having taught at Harvard for 60 years and for many decades holding a chair or professorship in government. He took emeritus status this past year. He's still a senior fellow as well at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Mansfield has written books on, this is his phrasing, Edmund Burke and the Nature of Political Parties, on Machiavelli and the Invention of Indirect Government, in defense of a defensible liberalism, and in favor of a constitutional American political science. He's also written books on the discovery and development of the theory of executive power. He's a translator of 3 of Machiavelli's works and 1 of Tocqueville's. His most recent books, 15 or more, most recent books are Manliness, 2006, Tocqueville, A Very Short Introduction, 2016, and just last year, Machiavelli's Effectual Truth, Creating the Modern World, which includes a 98-page chapter on Montesquieu. I had to resist the temptation to throw away the notes and just ask him about that chapter, but I'll stick to the script. Just a few mentions of awards and recognition of his scholarly and civic service. He received the National Humanities Medal from the President of the United States in 2007 and has served as the president of the New England Political Science Association. And his wife, Anna Schmidt, has joined us here for the conference in Arizona. So please join me in welcoming Professor Harvey Mansfield. So I asked Harvey to begin by explaining how it was that he was asked to write a founding mission statement for this new department at Arizona State University.
I was asked by Dean at the time, Pat Kenny. I understand he's now provost or
Executive Vice Provost, yes.
Oh, Executive Vice Provost. That was very impressive. Well, it turned out that the Arizona legislature had passed an appropriation to give voice to conservatives in Arizona's universities, and especially in this one, which accepted it. And he fixed on me to advise him. And the first thing I said was, drop conservative, say great books. And that still raises a question as to the sort of character of this enterprise of the civic and economic and leadership school. because on the one hand, you've got the motivating factor, the conservatives want a voice, and on the other hand, you've got the goal towards which they are headed, which is nonpartisan, something that will help everybody. So it's perhaps better to be named by the goal you have in view than by the motive which is pushing you in that direction. I wrote the mission statement in response to Dean Kenny's request. I was sitting in an apartment belonging to my brother in an important city called Paris in the country called France. And so there may be a little of that French elegance or in cuisine, which you can taste when you read this mission statement. It was meant more to get it through the university than to be a statement for the ages. And I think perhaps it still has more of that short-term quality about it.
I beg to differ. I think it could be a statement for the ages, and I knew Montesquieu had to be back there somewhere. The spirit of Paris was influencing you. So there are copies at most of the tables, I think, of this one-page mission statement on behalf of an advisory committee as well that Dean Kenny had assembled, and Catherine Zuckert is here, also a member of the advisory committee, 3 professors from Stanford University and the Hoover Institution as well. And Catherine still has a continuing relationship with the school. She and her husband Michael come every spring as visiting scholars and to teach in the school. So Harvey, we agreed that I would ask you a series of questions about the mission statement and the larger meanings of it, and in a way guidance it might provide in a continuing way to this department school, but to what is now a national movement of 13 such entities, including SCETL, in 8 states, most of them at the department level, several of them colleges with the deans, and then some centers. You frame it as an argument that this school should pursue inquiry and debate about large questions of life. What the best form of government is, what's the best life for an individual, what's the meaning of moral choice, among other questions. And you say it should be undertaken in 2 ways. I'll summarize the first as classical liberal education. In the phrasing of the statement, the study of great poets, great philosophers from beyond our time and borders, the teachers of humanity, their contending views of what we ought to think about our particular way of life and our particular way of government in a more general frame. And you mentioned Homer, Dante, Shakespeare among the poets, and Plato, Marx, and Nietzsche as examples. And then you write this: the other way of studying the fundamental questions is to look within ourselves to the American leaders, both intellectual and political, who have inspired us. And I note that you devote twice as many sentences in the statement to this second way of pursuing the charge or the mission of the school. And then you close the statement: in sum, our new school looks outward to humanity and inward to America. So my first question, in the way of framing the whole document, are you defending space in a university for kind of study that will improve both the theoretical, philosophical, universal ways of inquiring and the particular civic study of our own way of life by reconnecting or by strongly connecting the two? And then my second thought is that because especially those of us who specialize in the theory and philosophy have made the error of disconnecting to an extreme?
Connecting great philosophy and American politics is expressed in the title of one of my books, America's Constitutional Soul. What is a constitutional soul? What is a soul? A soul is a form. It's the way you act or behave, and it's also the way you think. Act or behave, that's practice. The way you think, that's theory. And America has this particular way of behaving and thinking, which combines two opposite tensions or tendencies. We're a can-do country. We think things can be done. We're optimistic. With our optimism goes a certain impatience. We can't wait. But on the other hand, we're a country that believes in due process. It's got to be done right, according to form, especially according to legal form. It's a country that values legality, has a lot of lawyers, engages in a lot of litigation. So, can do, which means you're impatient, you want to get around these forms that get in your way, and due process, which establishes and improves, but still venerates those forms. Now, democracy seems to have two meanings. One goes together with can-do. Democracy wants to democratize itself further. It wants to make itself more the way it is. You see this in the Greek. Demos means people. Demotic means what is popular. The populist, you might say, using today's term, the populist understanding of democracy. But then the word democracy is demos and kratein. Kratein means power. Power means what makes democracy able to rule. And what makes democracy able to rule may be things that aren't democratic. And I think this is the fundamental thought that inspires the Federalist and America's constitutional soul, that the most powerful thing in a republic or a democracy is the power of the people. But then where's the greatest danger of abuse, if not where the greatest power is? So one must sort of work against the tendency of democracy to be demotic in order to preserve its ability to continue and rule as a democracy. So I've lived a life in which there are a number of revolutions in the direction generally of democratization. Democratization is my word for what was called in the previous panel dynamism, becoming more democratic. The first was perhaps meritocracy. I got into Harvard from North High School in Columbus, Ohio. I was in the first class at Harvard with an equal number of admissions from prep schools and high schools. So I was democratizing Harvard in this strange way. Today we argue meritocracy. Meritocracy seems to be undemocratic, but maybe it's an example of this thing that seems to be democratic that makes democracy work better. There's only two ways to choose people in democracy that are really democratic. And the first, of course, is by lottery, when everybody is assumed to be equal to everybody else, and you only get preferred by chance. And the second is, well, you are being selected. That's already beyond democracy, towards aristocracy. You're being selected because you're better in some respect, but you're better in merit. And your merit is doing things that are necessary and helpful to democracy. So meritocracy in that way, it can be understood as something democratic. Then there was the welfare state, succeeding the New Deal. The civil rights movement, feminism, the sexual revolution. All these were bringers, and then last, perhaps technology, computers, the internet, social media, all ways to break down the barriers between us or the forms that separate us towards ever greater democracy. I can illustrate this with two stories from students of mine at Harvard. One was a senior, and he was reflecting on the first class that he took as a freshman, which was in expository writing, taught by a lowly instructor, not a regular member of the Harvard faculty, who began her course by asking each of the students in this seminar why they wanted to come to Harvard. And they went around to the table, around the table, and finally came to my student, who said, I came here to get an education. The lady said, at last, a Harvard student who doesn't want to be president. And he answered, I didn't say that. That was America's constitutional soul. See, they all wanted to be president. That's a constitutional officer. It didn't enter their minds that there could be an unconstitutional officer that was above a mere officer of an existing regime. The kind of tribe of the lion and the eagle that Lincoln talked about in his speech on the perpetuation of our institutions. A Napoleon, if you like. And note, you become president by getting the consent of the people. The other student was a short girl, I'm going to call her, of Chinese extraction. She had a short name, 3 letters in her first name and 2 letters in her last name. I could have picked her up. I didn't do it. And she said, I came here because I want to have an impact. And that's so big. That's a hot word today. They even say impactful. Having an impact is not getting elected. Having an impact is not necessarily with the consent of the person that you're impacting. And the same thing with those revolutions that I talked about. Like the first one, meritocracy, and perhaps others, civil rights, were planned and were accomplished by consent. But others weren't, or were a kind of combination of consent, and it just happens. It just happens that somebody invents computers and changes all our lives without our consent. So America's constitutional soul has this duality between what it can control and what it barely can control as it becomes more and more democratic. That's why our country exists only from generation to generation. It has to be renewed, picked up, and kept, and preserved by each generation. There's a force that is so powerful the force of the people, okay? And our soul, which wants to control it.
As I recall, a phrase that you use in America's Constitutional Soul is that the American ambition that we would become a constitutionalized people. So I want to ask about another theme of the mission statement, which I'll interpret this way, that this way of thinking, your way of thinking about the relationship between popular government and order, constitution, hierarchy had mostly been, by the time you're writing this in 2016, mostly had been either lost in academia or had been repudiated or derided. And one way you get at this is to use this phrasing about restoration of debate. To quote you, universities in America today live in an atmosphere of a certain conformity of opinion and suffer from an obvious lack of debate. And this idea, as well as the rest of the statement, was heard out there in academia, as I was saying, is now this concept funded by state governments, mandated, is now in 8 states, 13 different entities. So my second question for you is, has this mission statement and this idea launched a national academic field or discipline in higher education, which has multiple missions? One is to be raising questions that were forgotten and restoring debate and heterodoxy. And then questions about, if it is an academic field, what is this discipline? And the question, as some of us know, we have started a conversation among ourselves, should it be called civic thought? Should it be called American civics? Should it be called civic thought and leadership? So 2 questions there. Should we think of this as an academic field because the existing departments won't make space for the questions that have been forgotten? And then second, if it is an academic field, what's the name for it?
Yeah. Well, those are 2 words, civic and leadership, that are sort of nonpartisan, present themselves as such. I think that's good and necessary to do, but those 2 particular words have 2 disadvantages, I would say. And the first is that civic is kind of formal and reserved and goody-goody. It leaves out the sense of, to use a French word, fraternity. There's a great late friend of mine, Carrie McWilliams, wrote a book called The Idea of Fraternity in American Politics, which I recommend on this point. So, and it's one of the 3 slogans of, the slogan of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Civic somehow lacks that friendship and having a beer together, so on that aspect of being a citizen. But then also being nonpartisan, it draws you away from the partisan character of our citizenship. If you're intensely interested in politics and want to be a thoughtful citizen, an informed voter, you're almost always on one party or the other. So why is that? So I think you could consider the difficulty in American universities today as a loss of understanding of the original meaning of liberal. We need to get back to 17th century liberalism, which I'll give you the basic structure of in 2 minutes. Liberalism is a philosophy of rights, of individual rights. Those rights need to be protected, and in order to protect them, we form a government, and we do this by consent. The crucial right of all other rights is the right of consent, because it's by consent that your rights are most secure. But the purpose of government is but to protect those rights. It's not to exercise them. It's not to look over your shoulder and tell you how you should exercise your right. You have a right to free speech, but the government shouldn't be telling you what to say. You have a right to look at the weather and see what's coming, but you don't need a Harvard vice president to call you the day before it's going to snow, as happens in our overprotected, my overprotected university. So that means that there's a realm, often I call this of civil liberty, or the civil spirited, which is protected by government but not decided by government. And therefore it has a kind of vacuum. And that vacuum gets filled, because nature abhors a vacuum, very quickly. In our country, it was immediately formed by two parties, say the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, which became the Federalists and the Republicans, and the Democratic Republicans and the Whigs, and so on. And today, our two parties. What has to be, if this is going to be a free country based on rights, is that we make our decisions by elections, and the party that loses has to vacate the office in order to let the winner take it. That means that each of the two parties has to recognize that the other party exists and has a certain right to exist and to win, and that most all wins are temporary, and so too, therefore, are all losses. And you have to accept this halfway civic responsibility. You have to become a partisan of the two-party system, something very difficult to do. At Harvard, we hate Yale. Well, if Harvard won every game against Yale, which we always want to do at the start of every game, it wouldn't be a rivalry. It's not a win without the possibility of a loss. So we need those bastards, those blue bastards. And we depend on them. And I think conservatives today have a better understanding of this than do liberals. Liberals think that conservatives aren't really needed. They tend to understand their liberalism as feeling sorry for people. They want our country to be a community, a whole in which nobody is left out. So they focus on the people who might be left out. And so they use the word marginalized. People that are on the margin. Another word they use is vulnerable. People who are vulnerable. So they understand morality as dominated by the need to feel sorry for people. A liberal is a person who spends his life looking for people to be sorry for. Whereas conservatives think that some people are better than others. And they contribute more. They help out more. They deserve, therefore, more recognition and respect. This whole that the Democrats want needs to have a certain hierarchy or respect those who contribute more than others, and those people deserve to be admired. So whereas a liberal tends to look down on those he patronizes, a conservative looks up towards those he admires. Each needs the other. In all your admiration, you can't forget about the people you should feel sorry for. And in all your patronizing of those you feel sorry for, you can't help admiring the few who perhaps lead you in the program of making the vulnerable people feel secure. So this two-party notion of civic understanding has been lost in our universities. And it's mainly, I think, because of the domination of the Democratic Party, because they're the ones who less well understand the need or even the inevitability of two parties. That inevitability you can find in Aristotle and also in Tocqueville. And today, since we live in a generally democratic country, it's a little bit harder for the Republicans because their general message is, or can be said to be, and is attacked as, undemocratic. So they have to find ways in which you can admire people in a democratic way. Lincoln did that with this notion of free labor. And it's generally done by a preference for those who earn their living as opposed to those who get it from the government. Something Romney got criticized for in 2012. So that's my understanding of the sort of the two temperaments and the two ways of thinking that inhabit our common 17th century liberalism.
To follow up, can, at elite universities such as Harvard or other spaces in academia, can the existing disciplines which have forgotten this view, because political science, it's history, philosophy, but it spreads farther, right? Classics and literature, and can these disciplines be reformed at this point, or would a new, clearly what's happening is new departments, colleges are being established, but should a new academic field, and I'm still looking for your advice on a title, be formed, or should we try to reform the existing disciplines just close to home at Harvard or at other elite PhD granting institutions?
All of the above, that's my answer. Yeah, I'm not objecting to Civic. I think that's good. But it needs to be infused with a sense of the partisanship that can often look uncivic. And the solution to which is not the abolition of partisanship, but the toleration of the other guy. The need for, and as for the universities, I think, I'm not going to surrender Harvard to the woke. I don't think we should do that. We should, that battle should be fought in all universities and much harder, and much higher degree than it is now. And maybe there's been a certain change in that direction, which might point to the possibility of puncturing the bubble, which is, and there's a group at Harvard for about 170 faculty that is called the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard. And those are all liberals. The Harvard faculty is divided between a minority of progressives and a majority of liberals. And the progressives do the leading, and the liberals do the consenting or the going along. And they may have decided with these two recent disasters that have occurred to Harvard and to sort of the most prestigious universities recently, that now is the time to wonder about things that we've accepted without thinking through, such as diversity. Just to say a word about diversity at Harvard, the two disasters that occurred to it are, the first, a Supreme Court decision against affirmative action, and second, the unfortunate fall of our newly created diversity president. As Claudine Gay said, was kind of picture perfect as the woke candidate, and it didn't work out. So I'm hopeful. And there's somebody at Harvard, Steven Pinker, a professor of psychology, a liberal, who started this council that I mentioned, and gave it 5 policies, which I'll recite to you. These are not demands, and they all have to be understood prudently, and some of them are inconsistent with each other in certain circumstances. But the first is free speech. At universities, people should be able to say what they please, with some reservations, again, prudence. Second, no coercion. No group should be able to force itself on others in such a way that those others are forced to listen by occupying or by demonstrating or protesting in some violent or nonviolent way, which inconveniences others and thrusts you into their listening. And the third is viewpoint diversity, and that means the viewpoint of the other party. It doesn't mean the viewpoint of the extremes. At Harvard at present, there are more Palestinians than conservatives. I'd like to see that ratio reversed. And I don't think that's an unreasonable idea. That's number 3. And the fourth is neutrality. That in general, the universities, and this is in common with the University of Chicago, the so-called Calvin principle, shouldn't take stands on partisan issues. And that extends, in my view, to commencements. The Harvard commencement is like a meeting of the Democratic National Convention that occurs every 4 years. And every speaker is on the left. No, let's trade it 1 year to the next and engross our alumni who come and their parents with an example of the way a university should be conducted. That's the most public sort of celebration, a showing of every university, what you do with your commencement. And the fifth thing is do away with DEI. So those.
This is the Council on Academic Affairs, of which you are a member.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Almost silent member. because I don't want to embarrass them.
I'll add that a friend of our school, Jane Kamensky, history professor, was one of the co-founders with Steven Pinker of that council. And Jane has just resigned her full professorship at Harvard in history to become the president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, Monticello, to devote herself to broader civic education as America 250 is approaching. Well, I will ask one last question in the spirit of recognizing democracy, of feeling sorry for the audience that is marginalized and dispossessed. I want to reserve time for questions that the audience can ask. So my last question will return to the mission statement and the emphasis on regard for leaders and leadership, and American leaders and leadership. So an element of patriotism, one of the themes of the conference and the Civic Discourse Project this year. You talk about us being the most democratic society in history, and yet we debate its faults. And then I'm reading an implication that you suggest we're, as you said, drifting too far toward democracy and not recognizing other qualities of self-government, and said this, quote, "We need to see how the ideas of the founding fathers, capitalized, were both invoked and reformed through the succession of leaders after them: Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, and Ronald Reagan. And let's not forget Mercy Warren, Abigail Adams, Edith Wharton, and Betty Friedan. Nor can we fail to mention the two greatest books on America, The Federalist and Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America." So you've already captured some of this, that we ought to emphasize in this school a high regard for America, America's founding, and for leaders of both thought and action. And yet there's such a range of leaders given, and to capture the theme from the earlier panel, that baked into America is debate about the meaning of America, but it begins from patriotic regard or respect and then questioning. Is that what you're recommending?
Yes. That mention of Betty Friedan I had to wrench out of myself, but I did. I'm a pretty patriotic fellow. When I was younger, I used to like to say the following, that I had three beliefs. And apart from those beliefs, I'm a totally rational person. My beliefs are the American flag, the American eagle, and with a leer, the American woman. And a friend of mine, whose name was Seth Benedetti, looked at me and said, well, those three things, sort of authority and power and sex, pretty much cover all there is. There isn't anything left to be rational if you have those three beliefs. Aristotle said, this is in Book 3 of the Politics, that a political scientist is like a doctor healing himself. A doctor healing himself. Most of the time, a doctor heals his patients, but it may happen accidentally that he's sick and he has to attend to himself, and he suddenly realizes that he is like the patients that he normally treats with a science that applies generally to all human beings. All human beings having human bodies, subject to the same ills. So a political scientist has to remember that he too has a body, and that body is located in a country. And this is not an accident. And he's in that country full time as opposed to the doctor and his patient. So he is doing what the doctor does just once in a while. He's doing it all the time. This means that political science, so to speak, needs proper nouns. And if you look at Aristotle's Politics, he simply doesn't just talk about state and government the way the modern political theorists do, Hobbes and so on. He talks about people and things that have happened in Athens and Sparta and so on, and examples with a lot of proper names. In the university, you can distinguish between those disciplines which pay attention to proper names and those that don't. And the former are the humanists and the latter are the scientists. At MIT, most of the buildings don't have names, they have numbers. We don't do that. At Harvard, we have science buildings, but they have names. Names signify our self-importance. And for regimes, they signify the fact that we all have willy-nilly a loyalty or a disloyalty, one or the other, to the regime that we occupy. And one of the features of American patriotism, which isn't altogether captured by the word leadership, is that in America we have an ambition to greatness. This is right at the end of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where he speaks of the friends of human greatness and liberty. We have a country whose patriotism is connected to humanity, as was said before in other panels. America is an experiment for mankind. Great Britain wants to be great, but at the end of it, they're all just British. And La France has grandeur, but they always make a big distinction between being French and not. If you go over and visit their beautiful country and enjoy yourself, they don't invite you to stay. We do. We tout our country. We invite people to come even when we're visiting abroad. So this greatness is somehow connected to our patriotism. And now I'm going to make my last remark about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. But MAGA, Make America Great Again, he's got a certain vulgar shrewdness. Yes, there's two words connected with Donald Trump. One is great. He appeals to that. He understands that. We want that. And the other is vulgar. He's a vulgar person, and he represents in us the vulgarity of democracy and its impulsiveness, its lack of control, its unbeautiful, sometimes ugly soul. So, greatness.
And if we, and then please come to the microphone and if you'd like to ask questions, but if we take off from the word, if we start off from the word leadership, which is so predominant now, and refer to statesmanship and statecraft, that in a way could connect to the constitutionalism, which has offices, has hierarchy, has a Senate, has an executive, a single executive, has courts, has a chief justice at any rate. And yeah, so we can use that to start with leadership and bring in the greatness.
Statesmanship sounds too conservative and too goody-goody to liberals. So leadership is maybe a more sort of bipartisan term, which one could recommend.
Good. Well, thank you. And as is always the case, our rule, please do ask a question and a brief question, if you would. So.
All right. Just
State your name, sir.
my name is Daniel Mahoney, and I'm a visiting professor this semester at SCETL. I just want to follow up a little bit on this recent discussion of leadership and the spirit of your reservation and endorsement of civics. I always remind my students that, you know, the totalitarian leaders of the 20th century called themselves leaders, you know, the Vosges and the Führer and the Duce. Not to bury the idea of leadership, but to remind them of its ambiguity, and that it needs to be thought through. And in a way, I think one could have an intellectual and moral preference for the idea of statesmanship, while conceding, I think, as you just did, Harvey, that leadership is, as you say, more attractive and bipartisan in the current circumstances. But maybe you could say a word or two about some of the deficits of reconceiving honorable ambition or human and political greatness in terms of leadership as opposed to statesmanship.
Well, to begin with what you said, I think Der Führer is just to remind people that that Hitler was called the leader. So it's always a question with the leader whether the leader is leading or following. And in general, I think we're perhaps too favorable to the word leader because he's already decided what will be followed by more people and enable him to win, so that he's not a leader, he's a follower. And we understand today a great president as one who won thumping elections. But maybe he did that by giving people what they want instead of what they should have, or giving them an unrefined or raw version of what they want rather than an improved and perfected one. As James Madison said, that the purpose of representative government is to refine and enlarge. Those two verbs, refined and enlarge, what the people say they want. And Tocqueville said that Andrew Jackson was a weak president, though he's commonly taken as a strong president today. He's a strong president because he espoused what the people wanted. But Tocqueville called him weak because he thought that was weakness and not strength.
James Bone. Approximately 60% of young Americans 18 to 22 are not in a higher education institution of any kind, let alone fortunate enough to be in an institution such as this that has such a school. Relative to what you've seen in the civic education movement, do you think that these institutions should focus more on popularizing these ideas to the masses, or going deep in developing a research agenda in these areas? Thank you.
Very good. Again, my answer is all of the above. And then do what you can do. Do what you're good at. And also do what you can do where you are, what your situation is. So, and given the pervasiveness of identity, ideology today, I think it needs to be sought out and opposed wherever it is oozed itself.
Tunku Varadarajan. My question is brief. If Trump represents the vulgarity of democracy, I think that's what you said, what does Mr. Biden represent?
What is
if Trump represents the vulgarity of democracy, what does Mr. Biden represent?
Oh, yeah, what is Mr. Biden? He doesn't want to give up what he has. And he appeals to people who are frightened and not unreasonably appalled at the idea of another term for Mr. Trump. So he hasn't yet faced the fact, and he yet may face it, that the best way to beat Donald Trump is for him to resign or to give up running for re-election. I would say if I were advising him, that's what he should do.
Mr. Mansfield, thank you. My name is Dan Jones. I find myself just despondent about the country as we look towards 250. The 250th anniversary terrifies me. Looks likely to be one of two extraordinarily divisive individuals who are going to be heading up a lot of those celebratory events. The people, it seems to me that the leading lights of American civics today, if anything, they're just turning away from civics and staying out of Congress. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, these men, they formed a constitution. They joined the Congress. Today, our leading lights are sitting in think tanks and at universities. I mean, they don't even want to be a part of it. Where do we look for hope? Is there anywhere to look for hope?
Yeah, honorable ambition seems to be in short supply. And, but I listened to remember what Yuval Levin said. I think he had some very good answers on the question you put. That people, the parties today, people don't really want to win. They want the other side to lose. And I would add that there's a general opinion in favor of self-expression, which needs to be recognized and opposed. Free speech should be understood as making arguments, as coming out of the Greek word logos, in which speech and reason mean the same thing. Human speech is giving a reason. It's not for the purpose of expressing yourself and of course, making an impact, because self-expression really is a form of will to power, and will to power wants to make an effect on other people, but not to convince them. So we need to get back to a little bit more in the way of convincing, and to be a little more critical of the habits of self-expression, which people so easily resort to. And that I want you to notice me, rather than I would like you to listen to what I might be able to help you with. That's at the more theoretical level. We need somehow to identify the danger in self-expression.
Well, we don't have someone coming to the microphone. Jenna's on her way, but let me sneak in. Please do, Jenna. I'm going to sneak in a question about the premise of these new departments, institutes, colleges And since you use the word affirmative action about being problematic, Harvard losing the case they were involved in, there's been a criticism that these sorts of efforts are in effect affirmative action for conservatives in higher education, that that's not on the basis of their merit, their academic ideas, their worth of these ideas are being established. These are being imposed by Republican legislatures and governors with occasional Democratic votes and support. Is it possible to respond in something like the way you did about commencement addresses, right? It's a fact of hundreds of years of experience in modern liberal democracies that we have roughly something like a more conservative or traditional way of thinking in politics and parties, and something more like progressive, and there needs to be some effort now in public and private universities to say we're not capturing reality in our study of and our teaching about the human sciences and the humanities unless we make an effort to find faculty, to import faculty in places where there are no intellectually conservative faculty. Is that?
Yeah, conservatism needs to show how a party can act for a good that is common. We need to be able to show that the universities will be advantaged, improved, made more secure, all the things they say they want, if they have a better representation of opinion in the faculties, and especially, but also in the administrations and in of course, in the students. So yes, conservatives attack the universities for politicizing, and we are in turn attacked for being political ourselves. People have said, that's you. I'm the one who's being political.
You're inserting politics into
Yes,
the
I'm
university.
inserting politics. We don't want to, I don't know what opinion you have. I don't know how many conservatives there are at Harvard. That's what they tell me. I tried that in a large meeting, not of the faculty, but of the sort of chairs of all the departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Amounted to about 200 people, and I sort of snuck in under some disguise, and so I stood up and said, well, could any conservative identify himself by raising his hand? And this was 200 people. One hand went up. That's a combination. You could say that maybe there were some who were silent or frightened conservatives, but yet to say that they don't know what the politics of the faculty is a swear word lie.
Just one last thought, Jenna, before your question. You might look for a story in the Boston Globe, all of you, which I think was on the front page. Even the Boston Globe recognizes that this is an issue. So the headline of this profile of Professor Mansfield was, "Will Harvard ever get another professor like Harvey Mansfield?" Say it's a problem for Harvard if they would not. So even the Boston Globe is willing to entertain this idea. Jenna.
Okay, thank you. My question's about your statement that what American universities need to do to recover their true purpose is to recover the understanding of what it really means to be liberal, which means the protection of rights, including the right to free speech. And I'm wondering if you think that is the proper way or a sufficient way to accomplish the goal of restoring respect in the two-party system. You said you'd like people to become partisans of the two-party system. So is that likely to be accomplished by trying to hold up the banner of free speech or even academic freedom? Or do we have to make different kinds of arguments?
Yeah, I don't think that the fault of our hyper-partisanship is the two-party system, and that therefore the way to get out of it, get out of this trap is to multiply the number of parties. No, I wouldn't say that. But the way things are, it is bad. Again, I'll refer to what Yuval Levin said, is that the two parties are so close to each other, 50-50, and each of them devoted to the destruction of the other instead of promotion of itself. So that's what we need, more of that. And a little less gerontocracy would help, and a little more stepping up to the plate. But this is a democracy, and the people rule. And the job, and the difficulty fundamentally is in the people, not in the leaders. It's the people who are voting for Trump, and I forget the name of Trump's sort of comparants on the other side.
Isaac Hamrick, I'm a student here. Your university, less so ours, we're a public institution, but it was not necessarily founded on this idea of being a free and open platform for discourse, and that wasn't its only role. It was founded, as I understand, partially as a seminary, and there was an understanding throughout much of American history that at least part of the role of the university, particularly the private university, was as a character-forming institution. Do you think that there is a role today for the university as a character-forming institution, and how does that look?
Well, universities, both public and private, were, I think, meant to form character, perhaps somewhat differently. And it's a great strength of American higher education that it is divided in this way between public and private. It helps us. In Europe, most higher education is completely public, and this means that the universities are at the mercy of partisan budgets, and they tend to get short shrift. You visit the Sorbonne in Paris, it's pretty run down. It looks as if it was built in the 13th century and had never been repaired. So our public institutions are upheld by the desire to compete with the best private ones, and vice versa. So I think that's a real strength we have. Another thing I'll mention is intercollegiate sports, with the rivalries, Yale and Harvard and so many other. I think there are other universities with their rivals. Usually the state universities are divided between one that has state in the name and the one that doesn't. And those two hate each other. That's very good. It's an outlet for aggression, for hyperpartisanship. I recently attended the Notre Dame Ohio State football game. That was a great game. It was decided on the last play in favor of Ohio State, and well, it was really impressive. My wife was mentioning this too. How friendly both partisans were after the game, sort of bumping fists and patting each other. Maybe that's a characteristic of Notre Dame, something they like, being friendly to the opposition. that's an example of bipartisanship. In sports, that could help us in non-sports as well.
Hello, Mr. Mansfield. I'm Eden, and I'm also a SCETL student here. My question was also about what you said about partisanship, and I was wondering if you could expand a little on what you take to be like thoughtful partisanship, because when I think of partisanship, I think more about like conformity to the ideology of a group or a party and aligning yourself with that. And as a SCETL student, I generally don't think of our classes or education as like trying to teach us to be more partisan or more conservative because we're balancing the conversation. Rather, it's more about like encountering different ideas and taking the best of whatever viewpoints we encounter. So maybe just what do you mean by like thoughtful partisanship?
Yeah, well, thoughtful partisanship is usually partisan. I hate to tell you that, but if you think a lot about politics and work out your positions, you'll find that they usually cohere, and that you find reasons why more thoughtful people are partisan rather than independent. The independents usually want to eat their cake and have it too. They want low taxes and high entitlements, and following the usual human characteristic of wanting to have it both ways. But it's also a human characteristic to want to be partisan somehow and to take a side. So I think partisanship should be understood as something inevitable, something to be controlled and managed and ridden intelligently rather than to be abolished or even diminished, or diminished a whole lot. One way to bring bipartisanship is to have a war. So that has its disadvantages too.
We have time for these last two questions.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Brock Blaisdell. As someone who has studied American civics for as long as you have and written as many books as you have, I'm wondering if there is a piece of work you had wished you had written or would like to see written by an upcoming student.
Well, I'm hoping to write myself a book on American parties, the sort of some items of which I've been giving to you today. So I would like to see that written. And I'm hoping it will come into existence. I have trouble giving orders to other people, unless you want to be a graduate student.
Your first book was Statesmanship and Party Government, mostly about Burke and Bolingbroke. Right? So this is, this is an old theme coming back. That would be about America.
That book had a grandiose title, Statesmanship and Party Government. It was about one pamphlet that Burke wrote in the year 1770. A pamphlet that was 50 or 60 pages long and contained in it a definition of a political party, in which he said that a political party is a group of men united by some principle. So that's pretty good. United by some principle. He didn't say true principle, some principle. Therefore, there could be other parties than one. or each of which might think itself true or truer than the other. And principle is a good thing. Principle seems to be moral and full of character. And people often give praise as principled, but then that can also mean fanatic or too zealous on behalf of some principle. Hyperpartisan. So it would be good if we had some people who are prudent. And Burke had a great difficulty in his thinking, putting together prudence, this god of the lower god of the
God of the lower world?
God of the lower world,
Yep.
yeah. And prudence and principle, some consistency. So you've got to be consistent and yet not too much so. That's that fact, prudence but not, and principle but not too much. So prudence but not unprincipled prudence, principle but not imprudent principle. That's a great caution to all of political science. All of political science which wants definite answers to easily posed questions.
Hello, I'm Jessica Staggers, a recent graduate at the School of Economic Thought and Leadership. And I had a question about protest. When you were speaking about protest, a lot of change happens in universities, as we know. And protesting is one of our basic rights. When you were saying how you see protests happening and you're saying maybe it shouldn't inconvenience, I was wondering exactly what you meant by that. Should it just not be in universities, or should they protest in a more convenient way?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Being conservative, I'm sort of against protest. Being American, I'm sort of in favor of it because we got started through, American Revolution came through protests, violent, illegal. So most protest is sham revolutionary. They don't really mean it. So if you don't really mean it, you shouldn't be doing it. And it really is an imposition on your fellow citizens to think that your opinion is so much more valuable than theirs, that you get to disturb their orderly lives and their convenience to please you. That's a thought that should occur to you. It is the case, though, that when people say, I only have my opinion, I don't want to impose it on you, and then they go to the election polls and they vote, and voting is imposing my view on you, my view of what our society should be like and how it should be. So modern political thought begins with, you might say, the substitution of representation for rule. These 17th century liberals, Hobbes and Locke and others, wanted the government to come from you. It was, in a way, you, because you elected it. It is your representative. That's another way of saying it. It's you in another guise. And so when you pay your taxes, you do it to accomplish things that you want. Whereas in ancient thought, rule is the rule. rule is some principle which is made the dominant principle in every society. Every society has a sort of principle of rule, and the Greek word archein for it means beginning and rule and principle. A beginning that contains a rule and goes back to its beginning, keeps its beginning. And our government today is most generally representative, but in the way it works in the civil realm that I spoke of, the civic realm, there is an item of rule. And so our partisanship brings back Aristotle's notion of rule and tries to contain it within our generally liberal notion of representation. It's a mixed system. And the result is a government which represents you, yet not so much if you didn't vote for it.
Ben, you get the last question.
Your comments, thanks so much for these exceptionally interesting and wise reflections that you've given us. But your comment on protest, I just couldn't resist that provocation. So, look, it seems to me that learning civics, not in the goody-goody sense, as you put it, but in the sense of a commitment to engagement in and with as a kind of expression of deep veneration of political life, requires the cultivation of capacities of expression, right? And it seems to me, one of the real challenges of civics education, really of education as such, because it seems to me much of or most of education involves a civic dimension, right? Is the challenge these days of finding those modes of expression that are appropriate to participating in political life, especially for young people who look at the older people and think, oh my God, let this gerontocracy end. They're acting like a bunch of children, right? And so, you know, the days, sadly, of people reading books has unfortunately gone by the wayside. People read their Twitter feeds or their whatever. And you know, the forms of expression that are available to those who wish to engage, not just in the letting opinions be opinions, but in the practices of persuasion and deliberation, are constrained. And so I wonder what you would say, both to our professional community of teachers and to the young people who are looking for ways to engage in a world that they think needs, at the very least, attention and possibly significant reform. What are the modes of expression beyond protest, which I think one can take as, at the very least, an expression of frustration, that are appropriate to our political moment?
Those modes are generally speaking, argument. That's actually what our parties do. If you're in Washington and a strong partisan, you wake up in the morning and you look at and see what the other side has said. What do we need to say in response? Say if you're in your politics, if you're in office, what do you need to? What do we need to say to counter what they've said? So it's our partisanship has much more the nature of an argument than people normally suppose. And so I think that's the mode of expression which is most appropriate. It's really rather juvenile to shout slogans, chant slogans, and stomp around in what you're trying to make look like a mob. That's not really grown up. At Harvard, this happened in the late 60s. I couldn't believe it, that Harvard students were, chanting 2468, who were, I can't remember that. Yeah, slogans in favor of actually our enemy, the Viet Cong at the time. And ruining the grass in our yard, as it's called, on our campus. That's for that is not what a grown-up or an adult should want to do. If you want to chant slogans and shout and protest, go to the stadium. Or find a country that really needs a revolution.